So I'll talk about the practices and activities of those in principal supervisor roles that we associated with positive results. But before I do, I at least wanted to mention that these findings came in a particular context. This was a context in which the whole rest of the central office was working to shift how they operated. We call it working to provide high quality, relevant, differentiated services. So all that they were doing in the central office, from those in curriculum and instruction to human resources to buildings and grounds and nutrition services, all the work of the central office was becoming aligned to the improvement of teaching and learning in every classroom. So we'll focus in on the role of principal supervisors, but it is important to understand that it's likely that part of why we saw the results we did in terms of improvements in principals' engagement in instructional leadership was not just because the instructional leadership directors were doing what they were doing, but also because of the context that they were in, that the rest of the central office was also rethinking their work. But let's focus in on the principal supervisors. First, we call them something other than principal supervisors because what the successful ones were doing was a far cry from traditional principal supervision. And that was actually by design. In fact, the districts we studied were actually concerned that principals in their district were supervised and not supported in their growth. They were also concerned that principals too often felt buried in the central office hierarchy, experiencing too much red tape or delay in getting through basic central office procedures, time that took away from their engagement in instructional leadership. If there was professional development available, it was delivered outside their building in non-engaging ways, sometimes called sit and get professional development. And there was also little clarity in many districts on expectations of school principals. As part of their central office transformation process, these districts fundamentally rethought the role of the principal supervisor and said that that role should be organized around the idea that people in that position should have partnership relationships with school principals focused on their growth as instructional leaders. And we distinguish people who are taking on these new roles as ILDs, or instructional leadership directors. These were executive level staff. So in smaller systems, they were the superintendent or the chief academic officer. In larger systems, they were staff that sat on the superintendent's cabinet or fairly close to it. They were dedicated to high quality support to principals, and they were supposed to do that support provision 100% of the time by working with principals one-on-one and also by convening their principals in learning networks. This didn't necessarily mean they had to be in schools all that time. It meant that the main filter on their decisions about how they use their time should be, how does doing X or Y or Z help me help my principals grow as instructional leaders? So these were executive level staff dedicated to high quality principal support, and they were mutually accountable with principals for results in terms of principals' growth as instructional leaders. The people in these ILD roles that we associated with the positive results that we looked at took a teaching orientation to their work. What does that mean? Well, here's what it could sound like. This is what one ILD who took a teaching orientation to their work, here are the words they used to describe their role. They said, I'm a support for principals learning. That means I approach all my meetings with principals asking, what do I want them to know and be able to do with me and their teachers today, this week, this month? Then what can I do to help them have opportunities to learn and grow to meet those targets? It's just like setting up a classroom. Great teachers don't ask, what do I need to tell my students today? But they figure out what experiences they want their students to have to truly learn, and that's what they do. They create those experiences. ILDs who took a teaching orientation engaged in specific practices, specific observable teaching practices that we distinguish from telling or other traditional forms of hierarchically top-down supervisory evaluation-driven activities. These teaching moves included what we call joint work moves, differentiating supports, modeling, developing and using tools, and brokering resources, all in support of principals' growth as instructional leaders. We discuss these practices and our data in detail in several publications, but I want to just briefly share with you what some of these practices look like. Many of you listening likely have very different levels of experience with teaching and with these teaching moves in particular. So let me just say, if you take nothing else away from this brief review, listen for how intensive this work is. Think about the amount of time working like this obviously takes. And think about how well an ILD has to know their principles as leaders and as learners in order to work effectively from a teaching orientation. So one of the first teaching moves that we talk about is what we call focusing on joint work. These were intentional moves by the instructional leadership directors to help principals value their development as instructional leaders. And we borrow the term joint work from different strands of learning theory that really underscores this point, that learning is enhanced when teachers don't just teach, but they really engage the learner in becoming motivated to value their development along particular trajectories, in this case, principals' development as instructional leaders. ILDs in our study, who we associated with positive results in terms of principals' growth as instructional leaders, engaged in moves reflective of a joint work approach in several respects. For one, they started with principals' questions or with jointly negotiated problems of practice to help ensure that what they were working on when they were helping principals with their instructional leadership was something that principals actually valued. As one ILD expressed, from an adult learning perspective, we can't bite off 1,000 things. I look for strategies to make my work with principals focused and make it about instruction, a focus that proves that that's the most important thing that we do. If either of them, the two principals, get good at that cycle of inquiry or how they look at new data and enhancing staff skills about instruction, and we go really deep with that, then those systems and that discipline will have larger effects into the rest of the work. Just like you have a school pick a single instructional focus for a year, knowing that you get deep and good at that, that has impacts on other aspects of the school. So I like this quote because it's really reflective of learning theory in several respects. For one, it talks about how it's really important to focus on what your learner values and to go deep as a strategy for engaging them in the learning. And two, it also addresses concerns some people had with the ways certain ILDs were focusing on certain issues and not others. As this ILD communicates, if you do help a principal get better at certain aspects of their work and they become really expert at that, that should transfer to other aspects of their work. So when we say that ILDs that we associated with positive results were focusing on joint work, we mean they were starting with principals' questions or jointly negotiate problems of practice. They were also underscoring that they were mutually accountable with principals for improvements in principals' instructional leadership, that they were in it together. And so this part of our findings really emphasizes the joint nature of the work. And these moves were sometimes fairly simple, but they were significant. For example, one ILD, every time they ended a session with a principal, would say, okay, here's what you're going to do between now and the next time I see you to help you advance your work in instructional leadership, but here's what I'm going to do. Here are the ways I'm going to follow up with you to make sure you're following through on your part of our agreement. Here are resources I'm going to work to secure for you to help you move along with your work. So mutual accountability was a very important aspect of what ILDs were doing when we associated them with positive results. The ILDs we associated with inconsistent results or sometimes negative results, really taking principals' time away from instructional leadership, were much more likely to engage in activities consistent with more traditional principal supervision. For example, one ILD conducted classroom observations of teachers. They did that alone without the principal, and they sent the principal a report. We view that as a counterexample to joint work because it's clearly not being done in partnership with the school principal. We also found that ILDs we associated with negative results actually decreased the time they spent with their principals focused on their instructional leadership. And this, you might say, obviously would impact principals because they're not getting the supports that they need from their instructional leadership directors. But from a joint work perspective, what was important is that ILD's decreased engagement communicated to principals that maybe their growth as instructional leaders wasn't of value to them. And that, according to learning theory, is actually a significant barrier to learning. As one principal commented, consistent with this notion that decreased ILD's engagement communicated maybe that they didn't value principals' growth as instructional leaders, one principal said, "I think it's just like most things, particularly in education. You get too many fires to put out, too many other priorities. And so, in this case, when my ILD started to spend less time with me, I just got the sense that my ILD had other priorities to deal with, other than working directly with me or my school." Just as great classroom teachers differentiate or distinguish or personalize how they work with individual students in their classrooms based on their ability and other circumstances, so too did the ILDs we associated with positive results. They differentiated how they worked with their different principals. Importantly, they differentiated by principals' capacity. And this is really important because in some districts you see principal supervisors providing more support to schools with low test scores, for example. But those schools may actually have adults in teaching roles and the principalship who actually have the capacity to improve those scores without intensive support. Whereas by contrast, you've got schools with higher test scores with lower capacity adults. So that's not always the case, but what was important about the ILDs we associated with positive results is that they were paying attention to adult capacity and differentiating how they worked with schools based on their assessments of that capacity. As one ILD expressed what that differentiation could mean in terms of the range of the work they did, they described it may be sitting with their professional development team, listening to what they're trying to put together and then asking questions to help them through that. It could be in terms of an initiative that the school may have and they want to see how the instruction is going. Or it could be because they want a different lens on a teacher that they feel is not performing up to par and they just want my input on that. It could be a parent meeting where they're having to explain the data and how to look at the data. It could be around having conversations with some principals that may be stressed and overwhelmed and talking crazy like I'm quitting. So I like this quote because it really captures what we observed, which is an incredible range of work that these ILDs were able to engage in when they differentiated their supports to principals by principal capacity. The teaching practice that we found that probably stood in greatest contrast to more of a telling approach was modeling. And this is where ILDs intensively demonstrated certain kinds of instructional leadership practices as a strategy for helping principals grow as instructional leaders. Modeling was far more than just the demonstration. For example, we saw one ILD trying to help a principal learn to have challenging conversations with their teachers about the quality of their instruction and to sit down with data as the basis for that conversation. So with one of their principals, first they had a series of pre-meetings with the principal to talk about what kinds of moves to make in those kinds of conversations and what a principal might look for if they were observing someone else having those kinds of challenging conversations. When the principal was ready, the ILD then had the conversation with the teacher, demonstrating for the principal what that conversation could look like, with the principal looking on, taking intensive notes, which they then used to debrief with the ILD to discuss what they saw and what they didn't see, and what the principal might do themselves in some follow-up conversations. And then subsequently, in what some teachers call gradual release mode, the principal eventually came to engage in those conversations with the ILD sitting back in more of a observer feedback kind of role. So very intensive work involved with modeling. Just like excellent classroom teachers pay a lot of attention to the kind of materials or curriculum they use with their students, the same was true for ILDs. The ILDs we associated with positive results developed and used what learning theory calls tools or materials that invite learners to think differently, to act differently in ways that might improve their practice. We go into some detail about the kinds of tools that we saw in use in our study districts. They included protocols for observing instruction, protocols that help principals work well with data, for example. And as we discuss in our publications, what was important, regardless of which tools they used, that the tools were anchored in an explicit definition of high-quality instruction. So they really helped principals learn not just what high-quality instruction is, but how to notice it, the different forms that it can take. We also found that regardless of what the piece of paper looked like or the video looked like that the ILD was using as a tool, what was even more important was that they used those materials as the basis for challenging conversations about strengthening principals' instructional leadership practice. An aspect of our finding about tools that became important for us as we were thinking about developing standards for principal supervisors was how they used evaluation as a tool. The ILDs we associated with positive results mediated how principals experienced evaluation. So they experienced the evaluation materials as tools for their learning, rather than, as one ILD referred to as, gotcha tools. So they helped principals experience the work of evaluation as something that was going to help them grow. And they did that in part by helping focus principals' engagement in the evaluation on deepening their understanding of high-quality instruction and how to give teachers feedback on high-quality instruction. And they also use the evaluation tools as the basis for challenging conversations about how principals might strengthen their instructional leadership practice. ILDs we associated with positive results also engaged in what learning theory refers to as different kinds of brokering activities. These include bridging or connecting principals with resources beyond their relationship, and buffering or keeping interferences away from principals so they can focus on instructional leadership. Our publications go into great detail about the various instructional resources an ILD was able to connect principals with. I'll just make the big picture point now that part of why bridging is so important is that unless an ILD has an extremely small caseload, like 3 or 4 principals, there's no way that they alone can provide all the supports that a group of principals needs in order to improve their instructional leadership practice. So it became really important for an ILD not just to work with each principal intensively, but to think through what are some other resources I can get for this principal that might help them with their instructional leadership work. In terms of buffering, ILDs we associated with positive results did a lot of intentional work to protect principals' time to focus on instructional leadership. These buffering activities were probably most obvious in the context of the ILDs running principal professional learning community meetings. Some ILDs could not manage just the influx of demands the rest of the central office placed on these meetings. And for those of you who are familiar with school systems, you know why. I mean, so many people in a central office are trying to get time with principals. And when you hear that they're all being convened in a meeting, it's hard to resist wanting to get to them and take some of that time for your business with the school principals. But those meetings were supposed to be dedicated to principals' growth as instructional leaders. And one of the ways that the ILDs were able to keep that focus was by actively saying no, by keeping the rest of the central office out of those meetings so that they can focus on activities related to principals' growth as instructional leaders. You're probably getting a sense that protecting time is an important part of an ILD's work. Certainly that's involved with the brokering they did with principals, protecting principals' time for instructional leadership. We also include in ILD's activities moves that they made to protect their own time. ILDs work with principals day in, day out, and many people in the central office and elsewhere want access to them. Community members want access to ILDs because they've got a complaint about a principal or they want to see something done in a school and maybe it's not happening and they think the principal supervisor can help. As I mentioned just earlier, others in the central office know these ILDs have a lot of information about what's going on in a school that might help them with their work, so they want access to an ILD's time. But the job of being an ILD and the systems we studied was to dedicate their time to supporting principals' growth as instructional leaders. So it became very important for them to avoid the kinds of distractions that could take them away from their focus. As one ILD expressed, There is no way that you can ensure that children are learning, that teachers are teaching, and that principals are monitoring the quality of that unless you are in those schools. You have to be in those schools 50 to 75% of your time, and you have to have the courage to say, I can't serve on that committee, can't go to that meeting, can't do that right now, sorry, tied up in a school doing my business.